Case 1.
Robert Bales told a military court that he committed the worst American atrocity in the Afghan war, but he does not know why. 15 months ago, in the middle of the night, Bales left his combat outpost alone and murdered 16 Afghan civilians in cold blood, mostly women and children. The bodies were delivered to a morgue in a truck. 9 of them were children, and Bales had set many of the bodies on fire. In a deal, prosecutors dropped the death penalty, and in return, Bales pleaded guilty to premeditated murder today and told a judge what happened that night.
Staff Sergeant Robert Bales. Staff Sergeant Robert Bales was born in Norwood, Ohio, in 1973. He grew up in a middle-class family, where his parents were supportive but not overly involved in his personal life. He was a typical child who enjoyed playing sports and seemed to lead a normal suburban life. However, Bales had always been drawn to the idea of service and patriotism, which led him to enlist in the U.S. Army in 2001, right after the September 11th attacks. His decision to serve came from a deep sense of duty, a belief in protecting his country, and perhaps a desire to prove himself. Before joining the Army, Bales had a brief career as a stockbroker, but struggled to find lasting success in the civilian world. His enlistment was motivated by a search for purpose, but also an escape from the mundane challenges he faced. The job was demanding, and over time it became clear that his career in the military was consuming much of his mental and emotional energy. The birth of his children, which might have been seen as grounding influences, did little to shield him from the extreme pressures of his role. Were there any signs or experiences that could have foreshadowed their criminal behavior? Robert Bales's military career was marked by several tours of duty, including 3 in Iraq, where he faced the horrors of war firsthand. The cumulative stress of multiple deployments, combined with the physical and emotional toll of serving in a combat zone, left deep scars. While his service records show commendable performance, the strain of extended deployments and the trauma of war began to build up over time. Bales had been treated for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but the treatment he received appeared inadequate to fully address the severity of his condition. He was reportedly involved in violent incidents in previous deployments, which may have served as early signs that his mental health was deteriorating. His friends and family later revealed that Bales had been drinking heavily before his 4th deployment, and there were increasing signs of his emotional instability. These clues seemed to go unnoticed by military personnel, and even by those closest to him, allowing the pressure to build without intervention. On the night of March 11, 2012, Staff Sergeant Robert Bales, after leaving his post at Camp Belém Bay, a remote base in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, went on a deadly rampage. He left the safety of his base and entered the nearby villages of Al-Khazai and Najiban. Motivated by a combination of stress, alcohol consumption, and possible PTSD triggers, Bales murdered 16 Afghan civilians, including 9 children and 7 adults. He shot and killed his victims in their homes, and some of the bodies were set on fire. The cold nature of the killings shocked even his fellow soldiers, as Bales had previously been seen as a respectable service member. The violence erupted after Bales had reportedly become disillusioned by the conditions of his deployment, along with ongoing personal struggles. Some speculate that a combination of anger, a sense of powerlessness, and the psychological strain of the mission led to his brutal outburst. What followed was a spree of violence that ended only when Bales returned to base, where he was apprehended with blood on his clothing. Bales' actions didn't go unnoticed for long. The investigation began immediately, with military police questioning him as soon as he returned to the base. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Bales remained calm and distant. He initially denied the killings but later admitted his actions during his court-martial. His confession, however, was not an admission of remorse. Bales explained his actions in a disturbingly detached manner, recounting the events as if describing a war strategy rather than the murder of innocent civilians. His defense team argued that Bales was suffering from extreme PTSD, exacerbated by the stress of 4 combat deployments, and that this played a significant role in the killings. However, the prosecution maintained that his actions were not the result of a temporary mental breakdown, but rather a series of deliberate and calculated murders. The court ultimately accepted Bales's guilty plea in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, and in August 2013, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The decision to accept his plea deal was controversial, with some arguing that he deserved to face a trial for his crimes. The impact of Bales's actions was felt far beyond the Afghan villages he terrorized. The murder of 16 civilians, including children, sparked international outrage and left a dark stain on the reputation of the U.S. military. The psychological toll on his family, who were blindsided by the news, was immense. His wife, Carrie, had no idea that the man she married was capable of such violence. The Afghan families of the victims were left without closure. They rejected the life sentence, stating that justice would only be served if Bales was executed. This reaction highlighted the complex emotions surrounding justice in a case where the crimes were so brutal and senseless. Bales' case has also prompted renewed debates about the mental health of soldiers returning from combat zones and the adequacy of the support they receive. As of April 2025, Robert Bales is incarcerated at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He has served approximately 12 years of his life sentence, and given the terms of his sentence, he will remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. Despite his conviction, there has been little public reflection on whether Bales himself has come to terms with the crimes he committed or the deep psychological trauma that may have contributed to his actions. The families of the victims, however, continue to demand justice and struggle to heal from the wounds inflicted by a man they never knew could become a killer. Case 2.
An Army sergeant will never be free again.
A judge sentenced him to life without parole for murdering his wife, a private stationed at Fort Meade in Anne Arundel County.
Sergeant Maliak Kearney. Sergeant Maliak Kearney, stationed at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, was a young man whose family life, while seemingly normal on the outside, harbored the deep emotional struggles that would later contribute to his tragic actions. Maliak had been married to Carlin Ramirez, a 24-year-old Army private first class stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. Their relationship was tumultuous from the start. Friends and family members described Maliak as someone who seemed caring and loving at first, but beneath the surface there were signs of emotional instability. On August 24, 2015, Maliak Kearney embarked on a course of action that would forever change the lives of those around him. Despite a protective order forbidding him from contacting Carlin, he made a plan to visit her. This was not a spontaneous act. Maliak had meticulously arranged for his mistress, Dolores Delgado, to assist him in carrying out his plans. In a chilling act of premeditation, he instructed her to track her car's gas mileage and ensure that the vehicle would not need a stop for refueling, further proof of his determination to act without interruption. When Maliak arrived in Maryland, he entered the townhouse Carlin was living in, and what followed was an argument. Their marital troubles came to a head during this confrontation, and in a violent outburst, Maliak shot Carlin 3 times at close range, killing her. The scene was staged, and in an attempt to mislead investigators, Maliak placed their infant daughter into Carlin's arms after her death, a grotesque and haunting act that would further emphasize the brutality of his crime. After the murder, Maliak fled the scene, returning to South Carolina. However, his plan began to unravel. A neighbor discovered the baby, crying in the arms of her dead mother, and alerted the authorities. The police soon identified Maliak as a key suspect due to his strained relationship with Carlin, the protective order against him, and the testimony of Dolores Delgado, who eventually cooperated with investigators. Dolores, initially a suspect in the crime, provided authorities with critical details. She revealed how Maliak had recruited her to assist in planning the murder, even offering details about the purchase of the weapon, the disposal of the gun, and their escape. Dolores's cooperation ultimately sealed Maliak's fate. The case had its share of psychological evaluations, especially surrounding Maliak's emotional state and his apparent lack of remorse during the investigation. At no point did he show any remorse for the murder of his wife, even as he attempted to portray himself as a victim of emotional strain. The trial was intense, The prosecution argued that Maliak had coldly and methodically planned the murder of his wife, motivated by jealousy and an obsession with control. On the other side, Maliak's defense sought to explain his actions through a lens of emotional distress, attempting to paint him as a man driven to the edge by a deteriorating relationship and an inability to cope with his emotions. However, the jury found Maliak guilty of interstate travel to commit domestic violence resulting in death, along with additional charges related to the use of a firearm in the crime. Maliak Kearney was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in November 2018. His sentence would ensure that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, without ever being given a chance at release. Despite his actions, he showed little emotion during the sentencing, and the judge's words were a harsh reminder of the magnitude of his crime. The impact of Maliak Kearney's actions was felt deeply within his community. Carlin's family was left to mourn her loss, and the baby, who had been exposed to such violence at such a tender age, was placed with relatives to be raised in a safer environment. The case received significant media attention, not only because of the brutal nature of the crime, but also because of the betrayal of trust by a man who was supposed to protect his family. The public reaction was one of shock and disbelief, as many wondered how someone who had taken an oath to serve could become capable of such a brutal act. Maliak's actions sparked conversations about the mental and emotional toll of military life and how it can impact personal relationships. As of 2025, Maliak has served approximately 7 years of his life sentence, and his daughter continues to grow up in a new, safer environment, far removed from the violence of her father's actions. The case serves as a stark reminder of the dangers posed by domestic violence and how, in some cases, the deepest forms of betrayal can come from those closest to us. Maliak's story is one of lost control, emotional destruction, and ultimately, the irreversible consequences of his actions. Case 3. Sergeant John M. Russell. Sergeant John M. Russell's life before the crime was, on the surface, that of a devoted soldier, a man committed to his career in the U.S. Army. But how much do we really know about the moments that shaped his life and possibly pushed him toward a breaking point? Born and raised in a typical American family, Russell enlisted in the military as a young man, likely seeking purpose and structure. His early life, however, seemed to be marked by struggles that hinted at the psychological challenges he would later face. What was happening in his mind during these formative years? Did his service in the military expose him to trauma and psychological strains that are often overlooked in a career focused on discipline and obedience? Reports suggest that John had long suffered from mental health issues, including depression and paranoia. Could his military career, with its high-stress environments and constant pressure, have exacerbated these issues? His family life appeared to have been filled with tension, contributing to his inner turmoil. But could anyone have foreseen the tragic events that would unfold? Were there warning signs in his life that hinted at a deeper struggle? Mental health professionals later diagnosed Russell with severe depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, both of which likely contributed to his deteriorating mental state. Could his symptoms have been better addressed earlier in his career, preventing what would eventually happen? On the fateful day of May 11, 2009, Sergeant Russell was stationed at Camp Liberty, a U.S. military base in Baghdad, Iraq. He had already been feeling the weight of his mental health struggles, but what happened that day would be nothing short of catastrophic. What drives a man to pick up a weapon against his own comrades? For Russell, it seems there was a moment of deep personal crisis that led him to snap. Reports describe Russell as having had a heated argument with his superiors during a counseling session. His mental distress reached a boiling point when, during his escort back to his unit, he overpowered the personnel escorting him, seized an unsecured M16 rifle, and opened fire. In a matter of moments, 5 soldiers, fellow Americans, were killed in cold blood. What was going through his mind as he pulled that trigger? Was it an act of rage, desperation, or something more complex, a culmination of years of unseen pain and frustration? Was there a way to stop him before it escalated? The aftermath of the shooting was swift. Russell was immediately apprehended after the attack, his actions leaving investigators with a trail of questions. How could a man trusted with the safety of his peers do something so unthinkable? As authorities began investigating, Russell was subjected to a psychological evaluation that revealed significant mental health struggles. His defense attorneys argued that his mental health issues, including PTSD, depression, and a possible brain injury from previous combat, had severely impaired his judgment and responsibility at the time of the killings. Did his mental state absolve him of responsibility, or did his actions prove a deeper moral failure? The court case that followed was marked by a plea of guilty to unpremeditated murder, an agreement made to avoid the death penalty. But was this a just resolution for the families of the victims? How do you reconcile mental illness with the brutal loss of life? The prosecution, however, insisted that despite his mental health issues, Russell's actions could not be overlooked. The court ultimately sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Did this verdict offer any solace to the victims' families, or did it only raise more questions about the adequacy of mental health care in the military? The impact of the shootings on the military community and Russell's family was profound. 5 brave soldiers lost their lives that day. The psychological toll on their families, their fellow service members, and the wider community was immeasurable. Public reaction was divided. Some felt compassion for Russell's struggle with his mental health, while others found it difficult to excuse such a horrific crime, no matter the circumstances. How does a community heal after such a tragedy? In the wake of the attack, there was a renewed conversation about the mental health of military personnel, especially those returning from combat zones. Could more have been done to prevent this? Or was it an unavoidable tragedy in a high-stress environment? Russell's case sparked an ongoing debate about the treatment of soldiers suffering from PTSD and depression, a conversation that continues to this day. As of April 2025, Russell has served nearly 12 years of his life sentence at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. His story serves as a tragic reminder of the human cost of war, not only on the battlefield, but also on the minds of those who serve. Will he ever find redemption, or is he a tragic figure forever defined by his violent actions? In the end, the case of Sergeant John M. Russell raises an unsettling question. How can we prevent tragedies like this in the future? How much responsibility does society have in recognizing and addressing mental health issues in our military personnel before it's too late? This story leaves us with many questions about the fine line between duty and devastation. Could Sergeant Russell's struggles have been better supported? How often do we overlook the psychological toll placed on our soldiers in the name of national defense? What are the deeper implications of this case on military policy and mental health awareness? As we reflect on Russell's story, it's important to remember that mental illness is not an excuse for violence, but it can be a contributing factor. How do we balance justice with empathy, punishment with understanding? And more importantly, how do we ensure that those who serve our country are equipped with the resources they need to return home whole, rather than broken? Let us know your thoughts on this case. Do you think justice was served in Sergeant Russell's case, or is there a larger systemic issue at play? Case 4. Senior Airman Andrew Paul Witt. Andrew Paul Witt was a 23-year-old senior airman stationed at Robins Air Force Base in Warner Robins, Georgia. Born in a small town, Andrew came from a close-knit family. His upbringing, though not overtly troubled, was marked by periods of loneliness and a strong sense of isolation. He enlisted in the U.S. Air Force in 2001, seeking structure, discipline, and purpose. However, this outward sense of order concealed an inner turmoil that would later take a tragic turn. Was it possible that the strict military environment, designed to instill discipline, only deepened the psychological struggles that Andrew was already facing? How much of his personality was molded by the demands of military life versus the subtle wounds of his past? Did the isolation Andrew experienced within the rigid ranks of the Air Force trigger an eventual descent into violence? In the years leading up to the crime, there were subtle signs of inner conflict. Andrew was known to have struggled with feelings of inadequacy and was frequently described as someone who had trouble connecting with others emotionally. But were these struggles enough to foreshadow the dark turn his life would take? On the night of July 5, 2004, the lives of 3 individuals were irrevocably changed. The tragic event occurred at a house on Fort Valley Street near Robins Air Force Base. Senior Airman Andy Schlapsiek and his wife Jaime were brutally attacked, and Sergeant Jason King was critically injured in the assault. The question that lingers is, what led Andrew Witt to this horrific act? At the time of the incident, Andrew was emotionally overwhelmed by a series of personal disputes. A night out with friends ended in a confrontation when Andrew attempted to make an unwanted advance toward Jaime, a woman who had previously rejected his attention. Did this rejection, coupled with his ongoing emotional struggles, trigger a violent outburst? How far could one person's emotional instability drive them to violence when the right triggers were pulled? In the quiet of the night, Andrew went to the Schleswig home, where he violently attacked Andy and Jaime. It was a crime that appeared to have been driven by a mix of anger, emotional instability, and perhaps a deep sense of betrayal. But how did this man, once trusted by his peers in the Air Force, turn into someone capable of such brutality? The aftermath of the attack was both shocking and chilling. Jason King, who managed to survive, was able to provide crucial details, but the true emotional devastation lay in the uncertainty of why this violence happened. It didn't take long for investigators to connect the dots. Andrew Witt was arrested, and his involvement in the crime became undeniable. During the investigation, Andrew initially denied responsibility. However, after a series of intense interrogations, he eventually confessed to the crime. Was this confession a moment of clarity, or was it a calculated effort to avoid further consequences? The investigation revealed that Andrew's emotional instability, combined with a sense of entitlement, had culminated in this violent outburst. Psychological evaluations suggested that his actions were driven by a complex mix of personal failure, rejection, and possibly undiagnosed mental health issues. Could his inability to process rejection and isolation have been the final push toward his violent actions? The trial was a sobering affair. The defense team argued that Andrew's actions were influenced by emotional and psychological instability, suggesting that his mental health was a significant factor in his crime. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted a picture of a man who had carefully planned the attack and who showed no remorse during the process. Was Andrew's crime a result of deep psychological damage, or was it a conscious decision to lash out in a moment of desperation? Ultimately, Andrew was convicted on 2 counts of premeditated murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Was justice truly served, or were there deeper forces at play in his actions that no one had fully understood? The aftermath of the attack sent shockwaves through the Air Force community. The Schleswig family, forever affected by the loss of Andy, was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Jason King, though fortunate to survive, would carry the physical and emotional scars of that night for the rest of his life. For Andrew, the sentence was life in prison. But in the years since, what has changed in Andrew's life? As he serves his time, there is little sign of remorse or transformation. Has he come to terms with the magnitude of his crime, or does he still view it as an unfortunate event, dictated by factors beyond his control? In a world where psychological triggers are often overlooked, the case of Andrew Witt raises important questions. How can we better understand the invisible struggles faced by military personnel? How much responsibility do we, as a society, bear for not addressing the mental health issues that go unnoticed until it's too late? As Andrew serves his sentence, it's impossible to ignore the larger implications of his crime. Is it possible to truly understand someone's motivations when they can't even understand them themselves? Case 5. Private Isaac Aguigui. Isaac Aguigui, born in 1989, was a soldier in the U.S. Army stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia. From an early age, he was no stranger to struggle. Raised in a military family, his father served in the Army, setting a strong example of discipline and duty. However, despite his upbringing in a structured environment, Isaac faced early challenges that would go on to shape his worldview. On the night of July 17, 2011, tragedy struck. Isaac was suspected of being responsible for the death of his wife, Deirdre, who was found lifeless in their apartment under suspicious circumstances. Though initially the cause of her death was not clear, a deeper investigation revealed evidence of foul play, bruises and injuries that painted a disturbing picture of a calculated act. But this was only the beginning. Soon the investigation would uncover that Isaac had carried out a series of brutal murders, his wife's death being the first in a string of killings. Could the culmination of his toxic relationship, growing paranoia, and the birth of his child have triggered his deadly decisions? Aguigui's connection to a notorious militia group, forever enduring, always ready, fear, began to surface. How could a seemingly regular soldier, one sworn to protect, be plotting attacks to overthrow the government? The investigation into Isaac Aguigui's criminal activities soon expanded. The authorities discovered his involvement in a group with chilling ambitions. Fear had been stockpiling weapons, planning to wage war on the U.S. government, and even targeting high-profile figures. Investigators soon connected the murders of Michael Rohr and Tiffany York to Isaac, revealing a terrifying undercurrent of radicalism and violence. The pivotal question arises: what led a young man with so much potential to embrace such a dark ideology? Was it a result of isolation, influence from extremist groups, or the violent path he had already begun to tread within his personal life? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Isaac had been living a double life, one filled with calculated actions and cold motives. During his questioning, Aguigui showed no remorse. He revealed chilling details of his plans, admitting to his role in orchestrating the murders of his wife and others, but the true depth of his depravity remained hidden. Psychological evaluations painted a picture of a man who felt entitled to exert control over others, his victims, his group, and even his country. The defense team attempted to argue that his mental health issues played a major role in his actions, but the prosecution countered with the argument that Isaac's crimes were driven more by a thirst for power and control. The trial was a spectacle in itself. The court proceedings were tense, with Aguigui showing little emotion throughout. What did his cold indifference reveal about his psyche? Could the legal system truly provide justice for the lives lost at his hands? Ultimately, Aguigui was convicted of 2 counts of malice murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The victims' families could only watch as the man who had destroyed their lives was locked away. The impact of Isaac Aguigui's actions rippled through his community, his family, and the military. How could a trusted member of the U.S. Army, a figure of discipline and service, commit such heinous acts? The case sparked conversations about the mental health challenges faced by military personnel, particularly those dealing with isolation, strained relationships, and the psychological toll of war. Aguigui's involvement in a militia group only deepened the public's shock, showing how fragile the line between duty and radicalization could be. For the military, it raised unsettling questions about the screening process and the ability to prevent soldiers from becoming radicalized during their service. What more could have been done to intervene before it was too late? As of today, Isaac Aguigui is incarcerated at the Georgia State Prison, serving his life sentence. How much remorse does a man like Isaac feel as he spends each day behind bars? The tragedy left his family, especially his child, to grapple with the aftermath of his actions. His daughter will grow up knowing her father as a cold-blooded killer who destroyed lives, not just through his murders, but also through his deeply twisted beliefs. While some may argue that Aguigui was a product of his environment, was there truly no way out for him? Could his potential for violence have been stopped before it consumed everything he once stood for? His case serves as a chilling reminder of how unchecked mental health struggles and radical ideologies can lead even the most seemingly ordinary individuals down a path of destruction. In the end, Isaac Aguigui's case isn't just about the terrible acts he committed. It's about the deep, often unseen struggles that can drive a person to destroy everything around them. What drives someone to commit such heinous acts? What signs should we be looking for? And when does a system designed to protect fail those it's meant to safeguard? Case 6. Grady Wayne Wilkes. Grady Wayne Wilkes, born and raised in Alabama, seemed like just another young man eager to serve his country. A member of the Alabama Army National Guard, Wilkes enlisted with a sense of duty that many soldiers share. He rose to the rank of corporal and became the leader of an infantry fire team. From the outside, his life appeared stable. He had a girlfriend, a child, and a job within the military that seemed to align with his values. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Wilkes had experienced a tumultuous relationship with his live-in girlfriend, Brooklyn Floridi, and their domestic struggles were starting to take a toll on him. Could it be that the stress and instability in his personal life were starting to erode his ability to cope? Was he already showing signs of emotional turmoil that would eventually lead to a tragic event? His behavior had already raised some concerns among those close to him. Did Wilkes feel trapped, pressured by the expectations of his military role? Or was something darker festering beneath the surface? What would you do if you were a close friend or family member witnessing someone unravel slowly, but not knowing how to intervene? It was May 19, 2019, when the world saw the consequences of Grady Wilkes' escalating emotional state. The initial call was a routine domestic disturbance, something all too common, but what followed was nothing short of a nightmare. When officers from the Auburn Police Department responded to a call from Wilkes' girlfriend, they had no idea that they were about to be involved in an altercation that would cost one officer his life. Wilkes opened the door wearing military gear, helmet, body armor, and armed with a rifle. In an instant, the situation escalated beyond control. He didn't hesitate. Officer William Buckner was fatally shot, and the remaining officers were caught in the crossfire. What pushed him to this violent extreme? Was it an overwhelming moment of rage, or had something inside Wilkes snapped that night? What could have been done to stop him before it got to this point? Would you have known the signs? Could you have helped prevent such a violent outburst if you had been in a position to intervene? These are the haunting questions that follow the tragedy. After the shooting, the hunt for Wilkes began immediately. He was on the run for nearly 9 hours before being apprehended with the help of a citizen tip. The investigation revealed the depth of his actions, and while there were claims of mental illness and emotional strain, the facts of the case were clear. The officers had no choice but to respond to the threat in front of them, but the tragic outcome would forever change the lives of all those involved. During the investigation, Wilkes expressed remorse for his actions, but the damage had already been done. Was it genuine remorse, or was it merely the fear of facing the consequences of his crime? Did Wilkes fully understand the weight of his actions, or was his mind consumed by his inner turmoil, unable to comprehend the irreversible step he had taken? The court proceedings were intense. The prosecution argued that Wilkes's premeditated actions and the violence he inflicted on law enforcement officers deserved the harshest penalty. His defense, however, leaned heavily on his mental state, seeking some degree of sympathy for his emotional distress. In the end, the jury convicted him of capital murder and attempted murder. The sentencing hearing, where his remorse was under scrutiny, highlighted the grim reality that even someone with a military background once seen as a protector could turn into a perpetrator of unimaginable violence. How would you have felt as the victim's family, sitting in the courtroom hearing his defense? Could you ever come to terms with a life sentence knowing that your loved one would never come back? The aftermath of Grady Wayne Wilkes's actions sent shockwaves through the community. The police department, who had responded to a simple domestic call, was left devastated by the loss of Officer Buechner. The public reaction was one of horror, mixed with a sense of disbelief. How could a soldier, someone entrusted with the safety of others, turn on those who served to protect him? As for Wilkes, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a harsh reminder of how a brief, tragic moment could alter a life forever. What has changed for Wilkes since the trial? Has he come to terms with what he did, or does he live in a state of denial? And what of his family, especially the young daughter who would grow up without a father? What will be their future like, knowing their lives were forever altered by this single event? The media coverage of Wilkes's case underscored the disturbing reality that violence can sometimes be hidden beneath the facade of normality. How do we prevent these events from happening again? Can early intervention in emotional or mental struggles stop these violent outbursts before it's too late? This case serves as a grim reminder that sometimes, no matter the background, no matter the training, anyone can snap under the weight of personal pressures. It makes us question the strength of the mental health systems in place for those who serve in high-stress environments. And it leaves us with lingering questions. What if this could have been avoided? What would we do in such a situation, and how do we prevent it from repeating itself in the future? What do you think? Could this tragedy have been prevented if someone noticed the signs earlier? What would you do if you were the victim's family, the officers involved, or even the perpetrator's family? Stay tuned to Final Verdict for more in-depth cases like this, where we uncover the psychology, the legal battles, and the emotional aftermath of some of the most shocking crimes. Case 7. Soldier Ryan Gibson, Anderson. Ryan Gibson. Anderson's story begins in the small town of Everett, Washington. Born into a family that placed high value on discipline and tradition, Anderson appeared to be a typical young man following a well-defined path. He was a proud member of the Washington State National Guard, and he attended Cascade High School, where he graduated in 2002. It was clear from early on that Anderson had a deep interest in history, especially military history, which would later become a defining factor in his life. But there was more to his story than met the eye. As he transitioned from high school to adulthood, Anderson found himself grappling with a personal struggle that would slowly shape his future. The pressure to belong, to fit in, to be accepted. This psychological tension began to build over time. Could the weight of these expectations have played a role in his eventual actions? His shift from the grounded life of a student to the complex world of military service was not seamless. Anderson's search for identity, particularly after his conversion to Islam, began to fuel a series of troubling decisions. Was his conversion a genuine spiritual journey, or was it the result of his growing feelings of alienation? Despite the outward appearance of a committed soldier, there were subtle signs. Anderson, ever seeking acceptance, began interacting with extremist online communities, offering military information and secrets to al-Qaeda. What would you do if your loved one suddenly became involved in dangerous radical ideologies? Would you even notice the signs? It was in the early months of 2004 when Anderson's actions took a darker turn. While stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington, Anderson, a tank crewman in the 81st Armor Brigade, found himself increasingly drawn into extremist circles. His desire to contribute to a cause greater than himself led him to engage with al-Qaeda operatives, sharing critical military information about the U.S. Army's weapon systems, troop movements, and vulnerabilities. What would you do if you found out that your own loved one was trading secrets with the enemy? Could you even fathom such betrayal? At the time, Anderson was preparing for deployment, likely feeling the stress of his military career and the pressure of his own personal conflict. But this was no simple act of disillusionment. His communication with al-Qaeda wasn't a random decision. Was it his need for purpose that drove him, or was there something darker festering beneath the surface? He wasn't just a soldier, he was someone who had turned his back on the very country he had sworn to protect. Anderson's involvement with the extremist group reached a boiling point when he provided military secrets, including detailed sketches of U.S. military tanks, to undercover FBI agents posing as al-Qaeda operatives. Would you have recognized the danger earlier, or did his behavior appear normal to those around him? The FBI's involvement came swiftly. How long can someone continue to walk in darkness before the truth is finally exposed? When Anderson's activities were discovered, it wasn't a simple arrest. His betrayal of national security was grave, and the authorities were swift in their response. He was arrested in February 2004, and a subsequent investigation revealed the depth of his treasonous acts. During his arrest and subsequent questioning, Anderson's demeanor was revealing. He did not show any immediate remorse for his actions. He claimed he was motivated by a desire to belong, yet the sheer magnitude of his betrayal left investigators baffled. What would it take for someone to turn on their country, to aid an enemy whose goals directly conflict with the values they once swore to protect? The trial that followed was one of immense gravity. Anderson's defense tried to argue that his behavior could be attributed to his mental health struggles, specifically his bipolar disorder and Asperger syndrome. These conditions, they claimed, may have contributed to his impulsive decisions and role-playing behaviors online. If you were on the jury, would you have believed that his mental health was the root cause, or would you have seen it as a calculated betrayal of the highest order? On September 3, 2004, Anderson was convicted on 5 counts of attempting to aid the enemy. His sentencing was swift, and he was given life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. Would you have felt that the severity of the punishment matched the gravity of his actions? The repercussions of Anderson's betrayal were felt far beyond his family. His actions undermined the trust within the military community and sent shockwaves through the public. What would you feel if you were a fellow soldier, learning that someone you trusted had shared critical secrets with the enemy? How would you reconcile that betrayal with your sense of duty? Anderson's case sparked a broader conversation about national security, the vulnerability of military insiders, and the mental health of soldiers who are under extreme stress. His crime had serious implications for the safety of U.S. soldiers and civilians alike. But in the years following the trial, questions lingered. Did anyone see the warning signs? Could this tragedy have been avoided? As of April 2025, Ryan Gibson Anderson has served approximately 20 years and 8 months of his life sentence. He remains incarcerated at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. He is eligible for parole, but it's unclear whether he will ever be granted it. What would you do if you were the parole board? Would you risk releasing someone who had once betrayed his entire country, or would you feel that the risk is too great? In the end, Ryan Gibson Anderson's story is one of a man who was caught between personal turmoil and extreme choices, and whose betrayal had far-reaching consequences. The path that led to his involvement with Al-Qaeda didn't start with a single event, but rather a series of decisions, influenced by his search for identity, belonging, and purpose. His story raises important questions about trust, the fragility of loyalty, and the cost of losing one's way. What would you do if you were the family of a soldier who betrayed their country? Could you forgive them, or would the weight of their actions be too great to bear? Case 8. Dwight Jeffrey Loving. Dwight Jeffrey Loving was born in Rochester, New York in 1967. He grew up in a seemingly ordinary household, yet something in his formative years would set him on a path of tragedy. Loving enlisted in the United States Army at a young age and quickly rose to the rank of private first class. While much of his early life is shrouded in mystery, we know that he faced some challenges along the way, particularly with his behavior in the military. At the time, Loving was known for being quiet, withdrawn, and often displaying signs of aggression. Some experts speculate that his military service, with its intense training and rigorous demands, could have exacerbated underlying issues of anger or perhaps frustration. But were there earlier signs hidden beneath the surface that could have hinted at the darkness inside? Could his time in the military have triggered something far more dangerous? Imagine, if you were the parent of such a soldier, would you have seen the warning signs, or were they too subtle to notice? Loving's childhood and early years were marked by moments of instability, but it was his time in the Army that would truly begin to shape the man he would become. Was the military environment, where aggression is often nurtured for survival, ultimately a breeding ground for the aggression that would come to define him? Or was it the isolation, the lack of emotional support, and the pressures of military life that pushed him to the breaking point? On the fateful night of December 11th, 1988, Loving, armed and with his heart full of rage, would change the lives of several families forever. The motive was unclear at first. Less than $100 was taken from 2 convenience stores, but that night, Dwight Loving would commit 2 murders that would shock the small community. He targeted 2 men, both innocent and just going about their work in the local area, robbing them and taking their lives in the process. Was this a crime of opportunity, or was it something far more calculated, a reflection of his increasing aggression? But here's the haunting question. What would you do if you were a husband, a father, and you found yourself face to face with a man like Dwight Loving, someone trained to kill, who could take your life without hesitation? What would you say to your children if they asked why someone would commit such an act of violence? What makes someone snap so violently, turning from a soldier into a cold-blooded killer? For Loving, it was more than just money. It was about control, power, and perhaps the culmination of all the frustrations that had built up over time. But were there deeper, more psychological triggers at play? Was he, in some twisted way, trying to exert dominance over a world he felt alienated from? The investigation into Loving's crimes unfolded quickly, but the questions remained. Why had he done it? Loving was apprehended shortly after committing the murders, and his behavior during the investigation was disturbing. He showed little to no remorse for the lives he had taken. Instead, his demeanor suggested that he viewed his actions as almost an inevitable consequence of his anger and frustration. During his trial, the defense team tried to paint him as a victim of circumstances, someone who had been pushed to the edge. They argued that his experiences in the military had left him emotionally damaged, suggesting that this could explain the outburst of violence. But did the court believe that the military alone was to blame? Or was this a case of someone with deeply rooted psychological issues that might have been ignored for too long? On the other side, the prosecution argued that Loving's actions were premeditated. He knew exactly what he was doing. It was about more than just money. It was about power. The court believed that this wasn't just a man who lost control in a moment of passion. It was a man who was methodical, calculating, and, despite his military training, someone who lacked the moral compass to differentiate right from wrong. Loving's trial was swift and brutal. He was convicted of 2 counts of premeditated murder, and for the families of the victims, the justice they had long awaited was finally delivered. However, for Loving, the consequences would be far more long-lasting than any sentence. But what does justice look like in a case like this? When someone you loved has been taken from you in an instant, does a life sentence feel like justice, or does it leave you with an empty ache? The aftermath of the case was devastating. The community, shaken to its core, would never forget the violence that had been unleashed. For Loving's family, the fallout was equally severe. They were forced to reconcile the idea that the person they once knew had become something they could no longer understand. But what about the families of the victims? How do you move on after something like that? Can time truly heal wounds that deep? The media coverage was intense, as the case was not just about murder. It was about a soldier, a figure that people trusted to protect them, committing an act of unthinkable violence. This was not just an ordinary crime. It was a breach of trust, and that left the public both stunned and confused. Loving's actions challenged the very image of military men and women who serve and protect. Was there something we weren't seeing? Something beneath the surface that we'd all overlooked? Or was it simply the actions of an individual who failed to maintain control over his own mind? In the years that followed, Loving served his time in prison. In 1996, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld his death sentence, making clear the severity of his crimes. However, his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment without parole under the presidency of Bill Clinton. But does the passage of time change someone? Does it allow for true reflection and remorse? Or is it just a way to dull the pain for those who remain behind? As of today, Dwight Jeffrey Loving remains incarcerated at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His name, like many others, will forever be tied to the tragic events of that night, a night that raised more questions than it answered. The public may have moved on, but for the families of his victims, the wounds remain open. And for Dwight Loving? The question remains, can justice ever be fully served in a case like his? Sergeant William Kreutzer. Sergeant William Kreutzer, Jr. was a soldier with the 325th Airborne Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Growing up in a small town, he had a seemingly average upbringing. However, there were signs that something deeper was troubling him. He had always been a bit of a loner, often retreating into himself rather than engaging in the social dynamics around him. His early years were marked by subtle struggles with anger and low self-esteem, issues that would grow into something much more dangerous as he entered adulthood. Were there any signs that foreshadowed his future actions? Kreutzer's experiences with bullying and the persistent teasing from his fellow soldiers left him feeling isolated and misunderstood. These pressures, coupled with his inner emotional turmoil, may have been the catalyst that led him down a dark path. Did the lack of support and understanding from his peers and superiors create a ticking time bomb waiting to go off? On the morning of June 23, 1995, Kreutzer made a chilling decision. As the sun began to rise over the grounds of Fort Bragg, he prepared to carry out a violent act that would forever change his life and the lives of those around him. Despite his apparent low rank and relatively quiet demeanor, he had planned meticulously. He went out with the intention of making his grievances with the military and his fellow soldiers known, but in the most violent and shocking way possible. What could drive someone to take such an extreme step? Was it a sudden outburst, or had the pressures of military life been slowly building, causing him to snap? It was clear that his frustrations with how he was treated in the military, coupled with years of emotional isolation, had built up to an explosive point. The attack took place during a training exercise, where Kreutzer's anger turned into violence. He shot and killed one fellow soldier and wounded 18 others. What would you do if you were a bystander, witnessing such a shocking and unexpected act of violence? Would you freeze, or would you act in the hope of saving lives? The aftermath of Kreutzer's attack was met with an immediate response. The military police acted swiftly, securing the area and launching an investigation. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Kreutzer had premeditated the attack. But did he have any remorse? Did he understand the magnitude of his actions? During the investigation, he expressed little regret, and the true nature of his psychological state came to light. Was Kreutzer simply a man pushed to the brink, or was there something darker, more ingrained in his psyche that drove him to this point? The case was initially complicated by the question of whether or not Kreutzer's mental health played a significant role in his actions. The defense argued that his emotional turmoil and low self-esteem, exacerbated by persistent bullying, had created the perfect storm. But the prosecution focused on his premeditation, making the case that he was fully aware of the consequences of his actions. Ultimately, the military court convicted him of premeditated murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. Kreutzer's sentencing was a mixture of cold, hard justice and the tragic recognition of the mental struggles he had faced. What would you do if you were a member of the military jury, having to decide his fate? Could you separate the person he had become from the broken man who had suffered for so long? The fallout from Kreutzer's actions reverberated throughout the military community and beyond. The attack left scars on not only the soldiers directly affected but also on the larger military culture. The investigation sparked conversations about the pressures faced by soldiers, the importance of mental health awareness, and how the military handles soldiers who show signs of emotional distress. Kreutzer's family, too, was impacted, as they had never truly understood the depth of his struggles. They were left to grapple with the realization that the son and brother they knew had been hiding a darkness that would lead to a tragic event. How would you feel if you were part of his family, watching this unfolding nightmare from the sidelines, powerless to stop it? There are no easy answers, and the case raises the troubling question of whether more could have been done to intervene earlier in his life. Where is he now? As of 2025, Kreutzer has served nearly 30 years of his life sentence at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. What has changed for him? Has he found any semblance of peace, or does he continue to wrestle with the actions he took so long ago? For many, Kreutzer's case is a reminder of the tragic consequences of unaddressed mental health issues within high-pressure environments. Should we place more emphasis on providing better emotional support for soldiers? Or is it too late for those already lost to their own struggles? These are the types of questions that will continue to linger long after the case fades from public memory. As we reflect on this story, we can't help but ask, what would you do if you were a fellow soldier witnessing Kreutzer's breakdown? Could you have reached out to help, or would you have remained oblivious to the warning signs? And what if you were one of the victims of his attack? How would you process the trauma of being a part of something so senseless and violent? In every case of violence, there are questions left unanswered. For some, justice may bring closure, but for others, the echoes of the crime will never truly fade. What do you think should happen to individuals like Kreutzer, who commit violent acts while struggling with mental health issues? As we close the chapter on Sergeant William Kreutzer's tragic story, one question lingers in the air. What price does a person pay for suffering in silence? This was a young man who, like so many others, fought battles within himself long before stepping onto the battlefield. But in his struggle, he lost more than his way. He lost his humanity, and in doing so, he shattered the lives of those who once called him a comrade, a friend, and a brother. Imagine standing at the crossroads of duty and despair with nowhere to turn, no one to help. What would you do if you were pushed to the breaking point? Would you be able to reach out before it's too late? Or would you too fall victim to the weight of your unspoken pain? Kreutzer's story is a haunting reminder of the deep, unseen wounds that many carry, and it forces us to ask ourselves, how many more are out there suffering in silence, ready to explode with consequences none of us are prepared for? We cannot look away from the darkness within our systems, our societies, and ourselves. This is not just a story about a soldier who snapped. It's about the countless lives that hang in the balance because of mental health issues, isolation, and a lack of support. This is a call to action. As you sit here listening, watching, what will you do with this story? Will you remain silent? Or will you be part of the change? Will you share this story so that others may recognize the signs before it's too late? We owe it to the victims, to their families, and to ourselves to start to bring awareness, to act with compassion, and to ensure that no one else has to feel as alone and lost as Sergeant Kreutzer once did. If this case has stirred something deep within you, if you feel the weight of the story as much as we do, hit that subscribe button, leave us a comment, and share this with others. Let's make sure that these stories, these lives, are never forgotten. Let's ensure that we're all doing our part to break the silence and bring light into the darkness. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for being part of this journey with us. The truth matters, and together, we can make sure it's heard.